So I'm really happy to introduce, for those of you who haven't met him yet, Evan Wheeler. I met Evan for the very first time the day after the very first SIRACon, and we were just reminiscing about that yesterday. That was really great. But Evan is the director of IT risk management at Omgeo in Boston, and I think this is great because we've got a ton of risk management and tech risk management people in the audience, specifically some teams, and so. And much like many of the other people you've heard yesterday and today, he is also an author. He published a book called Security Risk Management: Building an Information Security Risk Management Program from the Ground Up. So today he's going to be talking about Stop Calling My Baby Ugly, elements of a mature IT risk program, and I'm really excited to hear you. So let's let you get started and give Evan a big hand. Thanks, Evan.
Thanks. Great. So there are two things that I wanted to kind of talk about today, and hopefully they feed it well into everything that we're going to be talking about for the rest of the day. One is the concept that an engineer I worked with recently brought up, and he said, every time you risk management guys come into a meeting, you basically sit down and tell me my baby's ugly over and over again. All you do is point out all the things that are wrong with the environment and our controls that are missing and things we're failing on and things we have to do. And eventually you just get tired of hearing my baby is ugly over and over and over again. I get it, my baby's ugly. What can you do to help me in this scenario? So that was really the premise for what I was thinking about with this. So we're going to talk about a couple of things today. One is kind of a departure from what we've been talking about the rest of this conference. There aren't going to be any linear graphs or any math in this presentation. This is more of a program level view of risk management and some approaches and techniques that I found useful over the years. I will put the disclaimer out there that these are my personal views and doesn't represent my employer, which I always got to get that out there. And thinking about what are some of the building blocks of a program and what are some of the signs that you have some maturity. And I wouldn't say that I've solved all the problems. The things I'm going to present today hopefully are thought-provoking, and people will take some of it back and maybe think of ways to improve on it as well. So there's really 4 classes of people that I come across that I really have challenges with. There's the do-it-yourselfers, right? So they're completely have no background in risk or even sometimes information security. Maybe they come from an operations background or something like that. And they get thrown into this job of, you're now in charge of security, you're now in charge of risk management, figure it out. So they go out to the internet, they Google, they find all these different pieces and parts of models and frameworks and things like that, and they try and cobble it together like you would go to Home Depot and try to do that yourself. Growing up in my house, there was always a rule that my dad should never do plumbing. Right? That was always a cardinal rule in my house. That would lead to very bad things. He probably shouldn't have done electrical either, but at least then it was limited to him just electrocuting himself instead of ruining the whole house. A lot of the people who are piecing together their own programs as well probably shouldn't be, aren't qualified to do that. And you end up with kind of makeshift programs that really don't have very much continuity to them. They're not self-reflective. They don't really revise them over time, and they just keep plowing ahead, never really questioning whether they're effective. And that really is the biggest, hardest question that I've come across in my career is our program really effective, and how do we demonstrate that, and how do we prove that? And I haven't solved that problem, but at least we're making attempts to try to call that out within the program. Then there are people that I think are more akin to like a safety background. If anyone's ever worked in a manufacturing company, you go into a plant or a paper mill or something like that, and there's always big all over the walls, how many days without an incident, right? And that's really what they focus on. 99 point whatever percent we've had without having some kind of incident of someone getting hurt or something like that. A lot of the operational risk teams that I come across approach it very similarly. All they focus on is incidents. Maybe they'll include like near misses if they're really getting fancy in their models, but all they focus on, incident, react, maybe do a scenario analysis based on that incident, and then they move on to the next incident. There's really no risk component, even though they present everything as risk anyway. Then there's more of the command and control type model, where it reminds me of working for the DoD and the military, where everything has a single risk profile, everything is considered to be the same, there's no deviation in risk profiles across different parts of the business, maybe different subsidiaries of the business. Everything kind of gets the same pattern, it's a one-size-fits-all approach. And then the final one, which I think has really been called out in most of the presentations throughout this conference, is kind of the fortune teller type person, where they're just completely guessing. They may throw some grass up in the air, they may throw some cards down or some bones or something, and that's really how they come up with it. And there's groups of people, it just amazes me, sit around. They don't even bring subject matter experts in anymore. So we don't even have to worry about calibrating the experts because they don't even bother to include them. They just all sit around as risk people, and they look at the information and they go, yeah, I don't think this will happen again. We don't have to report that. Don't worry about it. And that's how they decide what gets reported. I even saw a report recently where risk got elevated. And I asked, well, what changed that risk went up? Oh, it wasn't getting enough visibility. So we raised the risk on it because now it'll get visibility. And I just almost threw up in my mouth. Like that it just calls into question everything else that you're doing if you're just, arbitrarily raising things and lowering things. And, there's no clear thresholds for things. There's no clear idea of sensitivity or tolerance for things or escalation that's defined. So for me, those are a lot of the signs of a mature program. This is something that I've been struggling with for a long time. What's the right order and the most efficient way to start an assessment? Now, let's say you're an outside consultant or you're internal and you've been handed this scope to assess. And someone says, go assess this. How do you do it? What's the most efficient way to do it? You could probably start with any one of these four, and eventually you'd get around to all of them and you'd include it. But in my experience, there's a lot of difference in efficiency depending on what order you do it in. And I used to really feel like this was the right order to do it. You start with profiling, or ISO calls it, kind of building the context of the risk and really understand kind of the sensitivity or inherent risk, whatever you want to call it. And then you narrow that further down by what are the likely threats to your organization, that particular scope. And then you focus on scenarios and maybe vulnerabilities or weaknesses that threat might exploit. And then finally, you look at what are the standards or controls that you would put in place that would help mitigate against that. So that's something I've been following for a long time. But then going back to what the engineer said about you keep telling me that my baby's ugly, all we kept doing is getting to step 3 of identifying all the vulnerabilities. And they had no formal policies in place, standards, framework that it was built on. So all we were doing is picking apart things here and there, and they're just basically putting out fires as we identify them. But there's nothing cohesive behind all that that's really driving them to have what are really the key controls in the first place. How does that all relate back to your risks? There's no framework in place for that. So we kind of graduated from that to well, let's roll up our sleeves. We have some subject matter expertise. We have experience writing policies and standards and understanding the linkages between risks and controls and things like that. And let's help them establish a framework to work off of instead of just picking apart individual scenarios that we're going to ding them on. So one of the concepts out there, and unfortunately this is something that the big four kind of push, but I actually see that there's value in it, is this idea of this PRC framework. So it's a process risk and control framework. And basically all it is a spreadsheet of taking the ITIL IT process areas, mapping them to what are the inherent risks within those processes, sub-processes, and then what are each of the controls or key controls that will help in that space. And it gives you kind of a framework for looking at it from a couple of different angles and saying, okay, well, if I can prioritize which of these process areas I want to focus on, then I can pick out the key risks and the key controls, and that narrows my scope of what I'm going to look at and even assess in the first place. And in my experience, if there are no controls at all in place, they have nothing foundational, what's the point of doing a risk assessment anyway? you're not really helping them very much by just going in and basically doing equivalent of almost an audit. So this is one way of looking at it. So hopefully this looks familiar to anybody who's studied ITIL. And they're color-coded based on the priority. I'm not sure how well it comes across on the screen, but under, say, service support, for example, all the way on the right, some of the priorities are change management, release management, incident management, problem management. And there's a reason for that, because those are inherently control functions, right? I mean, those are inherently risk activities. Within problem management, they're doing risk assessments all the time, every day. So that becomes a huge feed into your IT risk program. And if problem management is flawed, you're going to get flawed data, and you're not going to get what you need for your program. So you kind of have to go and fix that first before you can pull it all into any kind of central program and make use of it. Similar with change management. It's a wealth of great information about where things are going well and not going well, where people are bypassing controls, where things are being rushed in, emergency changes, things like that. Those are all really important areas to really focus on and make sure you have a strong framework as part of your overall risk program. And I think that was kind of the aha moment for me earlier this year, was that all these areas are really part of my risk program. It's not just me as InfoSec or me as IT risk or even the operational risk guy. These things, which are embedded in all different parts of the business, whether it be vendor management or capacity management, they're all part of the greater risk program. So we need to make sure that they're strong and mature, otherwise we have nothing really to stand on. So there's a couple of areas that we started going through and assessing for this. So we tried to break it down and figure out, well, what are really the essential elements that each of these IT process areas need to be strong in for it to be useful for the overall risk program to be healthy. And the first thing is really defining, well, what level of maturity are you at now, and where are you really targeting? Where are you trying to get to? And that may depend on your industry, your business, et cetera, what you're really aiming for. But defining that in advance, that you know what you're shooting for, I think is really important, and getting agreement on that, what's the right level of maturity. Then looking at what are the key risks, inherent risks, and what are the key controls associated with those. Again, with the idea of limiting your scope to the things that are going to give you the most bang for your buck. And then identifying within that, what are the known gaps and weaknesses. And for each of the key risks and key controls, tying that to at least one KRI KPI that you can track over time. One of the things that I find with a lot of immature programs is, let's say you accept a risk, or you've lowered a risk because of some mitigation action. And you're patting yourself on the back that, great, we achieved this mitigation, we've lowered this risk exposure for the company. But then they never track that over time to see if that ever changes, right? They may set a reminder for a year from now to go back and reassess it, but there's nothing they're monitoring over time to say, is that risk jumping back up? Is there something, an assumption changing along the way that I assumed the risk was lower and now I can no longer trust that assumption? So having at least some kind of metric or indicator or trending is important for each of these so that you can look at the health of it over time. And then finally, actually helping with the control implementation. We were shocked how many people in IT just couldn't put their head around a simple standard, even how to go about writing it for the simplest things. So we actually had to roll up our sleeves and help them write it. And you get used to and you get good at facilitating that and getting information out of people and helping them figure out. A simple example of that is, audit had come into one company and they had identified that when they were doing maintenance on a system, they would suppress alarming. But there was no standard for how long you could suppress that alarming for. So some systems, they suppressed the alarms and it was suppressed for a year. So obviously that can be a real big problem, and there was no standard around that. So there had to be discussion about what, given the particular environment and the operational model, what was appropriate and then what would be handled as exceptions, They had never fathomed even writing that down or codifying that before. So this is an example from the incident management and problem management space. So these are examples of just two of the potential key risks within an area. And I'll walk you through this, and I actually stole these questions from audit, which I think is probably the only thing I've ever gotten from audit that I found valuable. But they had actually put together a really great questionnaire of some of the key things that they really wanted to know about an area before they came in and audited it. So this became our template for, well, these are the things that we should really fundamentally look at and make sure we understand about this area. And it turned out that most of them really could be tied together very well. So again, calling back to the framework provides the risks and the associated key controls. So we put those here. And then what we did is we just took a simple model of looking at what's the maturity of each of these controls. And as just a very broad brush, we looked at how formally is it documented. Along the lines of the idea of if it's not written down, it's probably not happening, which was true of the alarm suppression example before. So we just looked at it and say, control is formally documented, all the way down to, basically it's verbal. People just kind of know this is how we do things, but it's never really been codified anywhere. A lot of times things are buried in procedures or job aids or documents like that you can kind of extract it out and infer what people meant and kind of pull together what the standards are. But this can be a significant effort in the IT world. And what shocked me was in information security, we've had really set policies and standards for a very long time, and everyone knows what they are. IT was all over the place. They really didn't bother to write much of anything down, and everything was just kind of, as they went, they would kind of figure it out. So this was very helpful, and again, it helped us prioritize where are the areas where the controls really are weak, as demonstrated by the fact that they're not even documented. Then along the lines of I took each of the key controls from the last slide and tied it to one of the risk indicators. So these aren't very sophisticated indicators. One is meeting an SLA, which is really, you could probably argue, is more of an activity metric. But they had at least set thresholds for it, right? They had set a target for these metrics that they wanted to meet. How they got the target is a whole different conversation, but at least they were setting something that they were trying to go for. And it's important also to capture how it's being used, I think, that metric as well. Is it going to be used for day-to-day tactical decisions? Is it going to be used for more strategic decisions? How is that metric going to be used? Because so many times we get a lot of metrics, maybe to Doug's point about the dashboards, you look at it and you have no idea what that is supposed to indicate or what action it's supposed to take. And so for me, if a metric doesn't drive any action, then it's really worthless. So we mapped all that out, helped them understand the ones that they had and the ones that they didn't have, and helped them prioritize that. And there's a couple of questions below as well where you can look at some of the other things that we asked them about each of the metrics. Then a couple of other things on our questionnaire and included some, what are your gaps and weaknesses? What are your accepted risks? Looked at, history of loss events and near loss events across, the last 18 months. What are some of the concerns that people had? This is really a self-assessment for this IT process area of where do they think the concerns are? Are they worried about tools that can't support their process? Or are they worried about staff shortages? All those things are important for us to really understand and come to understand how healthy that process is. And then finally, at the end of all that, we gave a series of questions about what do you think your maturity level is for managing risk within your function. And so there's 8 questions up here that we asked them. And we came up with a scale. It's a COBIT-like maturity scale. And basically, this is what we used to help them identify where they were at now in terms of the formality of their controls, How aware is management of the risks? How are they doing at actually remediating the known issues? And where did they want to target to be? And then that became the plan, was to help them get to the maturity level that they wanted to be. So none of this is really traditionally a risk assessment. But if we had gone in and just picked apart individual things about their program, we would have never helped them get to a healthier, holistic kind of program in the end. And unfortunately, depending on your auditors as well, I had one auditor come to me during this process and say, why are you spending so much time with them? Why don't you just give them the findings and walk away? That's kind of the mindset, is you're there to point out what's wrong, suggest how they fix it, and walk away. Whereas we took a more collaborative approach and said, well, we'll roll up our sleeves and actually help you get there. So taking it back then, so that's one example, I think, of kind of a prerequisite for some of the stuff that I hadn't really thought about before. I hadn't really thought about those parts of the organization being part of my risk program. But focusing more on the central program itself, so what are some of the goals? For me, some of the goals have been, people have already talked about it a lot, improving decision making. Making sure that we're spending our resources in the right place at the right time. And the biggest complaint I always get is, well, everything else we plan for on an annual basis, and then you guys come along and throw all of that off throughout the entire year because you'll find this risk here and that risk there, and it's all unplanned work. And that completely throws off our whole planning process. So all of these efforts is a way to get ahead of that and try and predict where are going to be the weaknesses and plan out further so that people can actually plan for this remediation instead of having individual nitpicky things pop up all throughout the year that they have to scramble and figure out how to address. And then there was a big disconnect, and I see this in a lot of organizations I've worked with, between kind of the tactical level, where people are looking at kind of day-to-day operational incidents and issues, and the more strategic level of what people think the overall risks are for the organization. And neither of them really thought it was important to talk to the other one to get their perspective. So we're able to start to pull those together and play both parts and help inform each side of that conversation. So there's two approaches and really to building a program. And really, I think the most successful is using a hybrid of it, top down and ground up. Grassroots efforts can be very successful in that if you get people who are in the tactical part of the organization really loving what you've got for them, that you provide them a useful tool to help understand their day-to-day tactical risks that they can do very quickly and consistently, then getting that kind of on-the-ground support is huge, but also getting the top-level support as well, that this is going to actually go somewhere and you have somewhere to escalate the issues when you discover them, is also important. So hopefully, if you start at the bottom and the top and work your way together, hopefully you'll meet in the middle. That's really the goal. So this I put on, I guess it's probably a bit of an eye chart, but it's to give you just an idea of when you're putting together a program, there are a ton of different components of a risk program. We talked a lot about analytics over the last day and a half, but there's a lot of aspects to a fully developed risk program. And you can divide that up into whatever work streams you want. I divided it up here into 5 different work streams. But there's so much to be done, and it can be often overwhelming. So a couple of highlights for me. If I go into a risk program and they haven't even documented within their own program what the roles and responsibilities are, to me that's a really bad sign. If risk owners don't know what it means to be a risk owner, that's a bad thing. If nobody knows who's responsible for following up on actions, updating assessments, reporting metrics, any of those kinds of things, a lot of times that's never formally defined and written down, so there's a lot of misconceptions. I was even talking to someone recently, and they said at their previous organization that they had a system where they would send out every 6 months to all the role owners an email, and it would describe what their responsibilities were in this role. And they had to confirm back that they understood it and agreed with it. And they said the first time they rolled that out, it was amazing how many people in the organization said, I have never seen before that I'm responsible for this, and I don't agree with it, or I thought, Jill over here was responsible for that. And as people come in and out of the organization over time, they found that continuing to send that out sparked a lot of really good conversation of people who just weren't aware of what their formal responsibilities were because it had never been communicated. It was something that was developed by a couple of people. They came up with it, thought it was great, and rolled it out, but actually didn't tell any of the people who were owning any of the actions. And then we always talk about, and ISO talks about this a lot as well, and the 31000 standard, that being integrated into the key decision-making parts of the business is important. So whether it's a new initiatives committee, the vendor onboarding and review process, even annual budgeting and things like that, all those are key decision-making processes, and if risk isn't part of that and doesn't have a seat at that table, then that's also a very bad sign that you're considered tactical and not part of the strategic solution. Performance indicators on the program itself. This is the thing I have struggled the most with. How do I know that my program is effective, efficient, and is making a difference? It feels like it's making a difference. Everyone's happy about it, and all of our reports say our risk is going down, so if you trust the program itself, then we're doing great. But how do you actually know that, and is there any sanity check you can do? And then reviewing the scope of the program, the approach to the program on a regular basis as well. I see a lot of programs have schedules and frequency of redoing risk assessments, but they don't formally relook at the scope of their program. So are you focusing mostly on information security risks? Next year, when you reassess that, maybe you need to look at expanding that to more IT and operational risks, like the ITIL chart that we looked at before. Reassessing that on a regular basis and making sure it aligns with the business initiatives and direction of the organization is really important, and having that codified somewhere so that someone holds you accountable for doing it. Risk training, we do information awareness and security training all the time, but I don't see a lot of organizations that do risk training. A lot of the airports and train stations in Boston, they have the see something, say something campaigns, and it's always playing over the loudspeaker. And it's kind of becomes like a subliminal message in your head by the time you leave the airport, see something, say something. A lot of organizations don't really carry over the security awareness training into the broader risk space. So that's a really important thing. And then the last thing is really incentivizing people to identify risks. Some organizations have the idea of like a management self-identified risk, something that the auditors don't find, but someone kind of fesses up to in advance and decides, that they're going to mitigate or accept on their own, and they don't just wait for one of the control functions to point it out for them. Building that into your incentives is a good thing. Some organizations say, well, we're going to have 50% of risks will be self-identified by management versus one of the control functions or something like that. I don't know if 50% is the right answer, but it gives you an idea of, it gives people an idea of that this isn't something that they should brush under the carpet and hope that nobody finds. We encourage it, and one of the big things that a lot of organizations I've worked at is to also advertise that just because you identify it doesn't mean you own it. You'll get a lot more people identifying risks that way, because if everyone thinks everything they identify they're going to have to own fixing, then they'll be far more hesitant to ever bring it up. And then documentation. Tech people are generally not such big fans of writing and documenting and things like that. But in this space, not having these kind of formal documents is a bad sign for the maturity of your program as well. You really want to have a stated risk management policy across the organization that everyone's agreed to. You need a charter for your program that defines the scope and the purpose and the goals of your program. Any of the committees that you have, management risk committees, subcommittees, board committees, they need to also have formal charters for what is their role and how do those interact with each other and make sure that they don't overlap or cause conflicts between what their roles are. And you need to have tolerance statements, really defined tolerance statements, not just ideas of we just don't want to go out of business. Maybe that's a place to start, but you need to be more specific than that. So one of the exercises I went through with one company was we developed this program, and it was, by admission, a DIY type build of a program. We took a bunch of things that we liked and we cobbled it all together and we said, oh, this is going to be great. Then later someone came in and rightly challenged us and said, well, how do you know you've even covered everything that should be part of the program and you're not missing anything? So we took the ISO standard and we went through and I basically made a list of all the elements in the ISO standard that are part of it and put across the columns here every kind of formal document that we just had on the previous slide and said, okay, if we're doing this, again, where do we have it documented in our program that we're actually doing it, and where is it written down? And went through and basically marked them off. Some I gave us like partial credit for having parts of it addressed, but maybe not fully to the intent of what the part of the standard was. And this gave us kind of a good idea of where there were some gaps in our process as well, where things like, well, we just assessed all these risks. We never really thought about how often we would have to reassess them. That was never written down anywhere, so we had to, develop that. So there's a lot of different ways of organizing your risks, and some people call it risk registers, or you put it in a GRC tool, but regardless of whether it's in a spreadsheet or anything else, one of the things that I found the most valuable about the GRC tools is taking my data model for how I look at the linkages between aspects of risk and getting them into a tool where I can actually drill through and look at how everything relates to each other. So the first thing that I really like to understand is what are kind of the overall risk domains? What are the classes of risk, if you want to look at it that way, or families of risk? And then you kind of further break that down into what are the areas of risk within that, then what are maybe individual scenarios that you have, and then how does that relate to findings? And really understanding kind of that hierarchy that not every finding on a vulnerability scan is a risk, right? Those are all combinations of weaknesses that may affect various different risks in different ways and may relate to some more than others. So, for example, let's say at the highest level, our risk might be of a single point of failure, right? So this is kind of a general class or category of risk that we might define. And this is something we might talk about at our management risk committee at this kind of level of description. But then more at the finding level, there might be 1 or 100 of these different individual issues where, oh, we don't have redundant switches at our remote data center. That is something that I wouldn't necessarily take up to my management risk committee or my board, that kind of tactical level issue. But we can aggregate all those together to help understand how it affects kind of the thematic risk that we talk about at the top. So looking at that in a little bit more example, people organize their categories of risk in a lot of different ways. And Basil, we talked about a little bit yesterday. I'm not a huge fan of how they lump everything under operational risk. When I put this model together, I looked at, for the particular organization we were working with, what is really important to that organization, and we kind of organized it by impact more than anything else. So a lot of organizations I see, they organize it by who do you report to, right? So business continuity will have their risk category, information security will have their risk category, compliance will have their risk category, and that's how they report them up. And they don't like to talk about how much overlap there is between all of those things because it gets messy, because then this team would have to talk to that team, and they probably don't even use the same language or like each other anyway. So that would be really bad for the organization if they had to work together. So they all have their own kind of individual risk profiles. Well, I organized it a lot differently in terms of, well, in the end, what's going to happen? So service availability for this organization was really important. Being up and available to clients was really important. So that became the class of risk that we really looked at. And then we started dividing it out underneath that. So what are some of the other things that can cause a service availability disruption? It can be poor capacity planning. We could have issues with our architecture for resiliency. There could be data integrity attacks, or even an intentional denial of service attack. And when this model I rolled out for the first time, everyone said, well, where's the information security category of risk? And I said, there is none. There is no information security risk. Information security risks can affect service availability. They can affect legal and compliance. They can affect, any number of those or multiples of those. And so organizing that way was really hard for a lot of people to conceptualize in the beginning, but then they started seeing the value of really being able to tie that back to tolerance statements for the organization, because the organization understands how much they want to be up. They don't really understand how much they want information security. They understand whether they want to violate an international law or not. Those things they get, and they can put tolerances around, whereas kind of the functional organization of it didn't work so well. So this is I apologize, this diagram could be better. I did put it together late last night after dinner. But I'm not the best at like UML diagramming and things like that, so you have to forgive me. But this is a basic idea of the data model that we put into the GRC tool to track all this. The risk domain at the top level, then more specificity down to the risk area level. But these are still kind of, thematic risks. And tying those all to the findings or the issue or the weakness or the vulnerability really becomes the apex of all of that. And linking it in that way, then you can drill through any of this and you can say, what are the incidents that have actually occurred related to this? Who are the vendors involved? Which are the assets? And which products do those assets support? Which offices are those in? Which data centers? Which regions of the country are those in? Which control standards are being violated there? Which policies does that violate? Which industry standards does that violate? This really becomes the kind of the overall model for understanding how you can make use of all this data that you have. I'm way over time, so I'm going to try and speed up a little bit. This was my attempt at kind of describing the evolution of the companies that I've worked at and where they kind of go. They start with the just ignore it, then the stoplight approach, and then they maybe move to some, qualitative matrix in terms of maturity. Where most organizations I've worked with at really stop as kind of the narrative. And I like the narrative because it really helps you understand the different factors and components of your risk, so that when you get to the point of wanting to build a model, hopefully you actually understand the things that would go into that model. So risk profiling, I talked a little bit about. This is really just understanding the sensitivity of your organization, your product, the service, the process area, and you can define it and organize it in a couple different ways, but this is the one I've liked to use. Risk tolerance and appetite, I think, is so important. A lot of organizations don't formally define that, and I think that's really a mistake. The way I've used risk tolerance and appetite, and I don't know if these are great formal definitions of it, but for me, tolerance is what going beyond that, the company can't handle, and appetite is what the company isn't comfortable with. So when I've implemented it, it's been, tolerance is kind of a board level thing. If you're about to exceed or you think you're going to exceed your tolerance, that's kind of a board level discussion. And appetite is more of a senior management discussion within the organization of what you're comfortable with staying in. I'm going to skip these, and you can use them as reference slides in terms of the assessment. And the other thing that I'll call out here is for every assessment that we do, even though it's qualitative, and that's been knocked a lot over the last day and a half, and I have to stand up for qualitative because I believe it does add some value, we own up to the fact of whether we think we're mature in our assessment or we're not. This is something really new to us, and we haven't had a lot of experience with it. We don't feel like we have a lot of expertise in it. Maybe we're not calibrated in terms of our SMEs. We call that right out on every assessment so that management knows whether we feel confident in this or not. Including insurance, I think, is an important aspect, understanding your threats. And I included a couple of slides in here of ways you might demonstrate to management what some of the things are that you're worried about. And these are all just conversation starters, really. The other thing I want to just briefly go through is the idea of trying to understand what are the threats out there and how that relates back to your controls. And one of the exercises I went through a while ago, and this is from the 2013 DBIR, was just looking at what are the most common combinations of things that are actually seen in terms of the data disclosures. And I took that and I compared it to the SANS top 20 list of what are the scenarios that would actually relate to those highest percentage ones. And then the SANS top 20 list, if you're familiar with that, will give you the control standards that address that scenario, and then that relates back to the NIST standard and everything of which controls you should have in place. And the reality is you come up with basically the top 4 controls almost every time, and they're basic hygiene type things. So I'm going to have to skip through a couple of these, unfortunately. I do want to get to. And the last thing I'll just talk about real quickly is incident data. So going back to the model and the GRC tool of tying everything to findings, one of the simplest things that I implemented, and it's given a great bang for the buck, is incidents can't be closed until they're tied to a finding or weakness, vulnerability, whatever you call it. So every incident has to at least be tied to at least one finding before it can be closed in the system. And that really forced us to make sure that every time we were identifying an incident, that we knew whether this was a new weakness we didn't know about before and we needed to assess, or it was something known and maybe we needed to adjust our understanding of that risk. So there's a lot of metadata you can track within incidents, and I've tried to implement the Veris framework, which I find very valuable for understanding all the different kind of classification of it. But other things that you should really be tracking is simple things like, if this was a data breach incident or a potential one, did you notify your insurance underwriters? Because just the other day I was thinking, wouldn't that be nice to have a report of all the times over the last 5 years that we had to notify our insurance underwriters of a potential claim? If you don't track that, it's very hard to go back and gather that after the fact. How many times have you had to notify your regulator or formally send a notice to a client or something like that? All that information becomes really valuable over a course of a couple of years to really understand how things have shifted. One of the things I analyzed at one organization was, in the beginning, clients would accept kind of verbal notifications of things. And then we started to see a shift that everyone was requiring kind of formal letters and notifications and meetings about issues that happened. And that was a really important trend for the senior management to understand. And all that was just a couple of checkboxes on an incident form in the GRC tool. So that's it. Sorry I had to breeze through a couple of things, but the slides will be available.
Questions? Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. All right, who wants to ask a question? I'm ready for you. I'm ready to run. All right.
So do you lead off your conversations with your stakeholders by saying, I have the ugliest baby in the room first?
No.
Or used to?
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to, I've been taking lately a selfish approach. Which are the parts of the program I want data from? So I've been going around and trying to help them improve their part of the program so I can get better information from them to feed my part of the program. And that's really been my strategy, just kind of selfish. Like, change management. I really want to know what's going on there, and wow, you guys are kind of a mess in terms of tracking that. Let me help you get a little bit more consistent there, and so that we can feed in. And parts of the organization might be using different root cause lists, so you can't really compare HR's incidents to technology's incidents. So just fixing a couple of those really simple things really adds a lot of value.
Thanks. No, it was a really good talk, and I wish I had a program to build to go back and undo some of what you pointed out earlier. Another question?
Evan, it seems to me that risk appetite and risk tolerance are another couple of phrases that are defined in wildly contradictory ways. While you were talking, I mean, I'm not knocking your definition.
That's fine. It's very informal.
I pulled up the document from COSO, and it seems to me, for example, that your definitions are 180 degrees opposite of theirs. So I guess I'm going to give Ali something to do after he gets his paper published, which is work on some more definitions maybe. Personally, I've always, as a classicist and an English major, have really disliked the term risk appetite. It's hard for me to just deal with the conflicting images that evokes. But anyway, I think there's some work to be done there, because I bet you any two organizations, if they even knew, and I'm reminded of an example, my business partner interviewed the CIO at Shell Oil, not a small company, what their risk appetite was, and he just shrugged his shoulders and laughed, said, we don't know. So, I mean, he didn't know. Anyway, just wanted to put that issue on the table since definitions are kind of my thing.
Yeah, I'd like to just comment on that. I forget who it was that said of England and the United States, two nations divided by a common language. And I think that's really true in this space, and it's not two bodies, but a large number of bodies. Our paper is not on defining risk alone. It's defining risk and related concepts. What I talked about yesterday covers maybe 20% of the paper. So we're going to try and be as comprehensive as possible and address all these things. And they're broad-based expertise on our project oversight group. So we've tackled a lot of these issues. And whenever we try and define something, we always try and define it in terms of the business problem it's meant to solve. Because defining something in an abstract concept doesn't really help. It's, if I mean risk tolerance, how am I going to use that to make more effective risk management decisions? So again, I'm hoping to get this paper done soon, but we're going to try and tackle these issues as well.
I mean, for me, the way that I've used it, regardless of what you call it, is there needs to be a clear understanding of what gets escalated to different parts of the organization. So whether you have committee structures or however you do it, at a lot of the organizations I've worked at, there's a management risk committee, which is kind of the most senior level within the organization, and then there's some kind of board oversight committee. And the way that I've used it is there should be defined escalations for incidents and risks of what makes a certain threshold to be reviewed there and discussed there. And that's how I've used appetite, is basically, this is how we're comfortable operating, and anything beyond that makes us uncomfortable. And then tolerance is really, we don't think the company can handle that, and that's where the board really gets involved and steps in. But you want to have management managing most of your risk, ideally.
So who sets these policies in the first place?
So what I've always done is you sit down with the people who are really the owners of what I call the risk domains. So for service availability, for example, who are the stakeholders? The business owners of those services, the technology people that support them. And already they had an idea of, if this service was out for an entire day, can we handle that? And they're like, oh God, no, we can't be out for an entire day. Okay, well, how about 2 hours? Yeah, clients would be kind of upset, but we'd get past that if it was 2 hours. You kind of work your way towards what is the range that they're really comfortable with, and you get an idea of that.
So it sounds like maybe the board or most senior management is not handing these things down. What you described strike me as kind of tactical. We assess based on what we see from where we sit, And if we go past this, then we inform up. I guess the idea I'd always had is somebody with the 360 view at the top is the one who needs to establish broad guidelines that filter down.
Well, it is the people at the top who are defining that.
Okay.
I mean, it depends on your kind of business, right? If you're a service-oriented organization, you want to get input from the salespeople, from the product people, from the client relations people. You know, those are the people who really have to sit in the meetings with the clients and get the feedback and say, you know, you were out for 15 minutes the other day and that almost killed me. You can't ever do that again. You know, those are the people that have that feedback. And there are people who understand the industry view of it and how would that be perceived by the regulators, and you know, all those are aspects that you take into account to kind of figure out. It's the context, right? If you think about the ISO standard, it's building kind of the internal and external context for, you know, your risk.
All right, if anyone wants one more question, I'll let it happen. Otherwise, yep. Oh.
I'll make it quick. So we have heard from the OCC that they're demanding that the big banks have more forward-looking metrics to anticipate risk, to identify emerging risk. What have you seen in that space, and is this realistic, or is this just pie in the sky?
No, I think it's realistic. We're being recorded, so it's hard to talk about regulators. I think if you think about, you know, purely the information security space, right, in terms of things that are forward-looking, one of the slides I had to breeze through is, you know, kind of DDoS is old news, and destructive malware is the next big thing coming. You know, those kinds of outlook and having people focused on that and getting those threat intelligence feeds to really understand what might be the next big thing that you should prepare for, I think is very practical. And is something that you should have a part of your risk program focused not just on risks, and certainly not, you know, just incidents that you're seeing today, but you really should be forward thinking and trying to see what are the indicators of things that might be the next thing to target your kind of organization.
Thanks. Okay, now properly and again and with enthusiasm, huge thank you, Evan. Thank you.